The first snow of the season had barely touched the ground when Daniel moved into the house. It wasn't the kind of house you'd expect to hold anything unusual. 2 stories, an aging frame, white paint that had worn down to gray in places, and windows that caught the moonlight in a way that made the place look faintly alive from the street. From the outside, it looked ordinary, just another old house at the edge of a quiet town. But the silence that hung around it wasn't the comfortable kind. It was heavy, the kind that seemed to lean in against the glass, waiting. The landlord hadn't said much when he handed over the keys, just that the property had been vacant a while, that it needed someone to live in it again. He smiled too quickly when Daniel signed the lease. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but Daniel wasn't in a position to question blessings that came his way. He needed space, he needed quiet, and the house promised both. That first night, Daniel was too exhausted from hauling boxes to care about the strange atmosphere. He set his mattress on the floor of the upstairs bedroom, pulled his blanket tight against the winter air, and drifted quickly to sleep. The snow outside muffled everything, blanketing the town in silence, so deep it seemed almost sacred. When he woke in the morning, the house felt colder than before. Not the usual winter chill, but something sharper, something that settled in his bones. He checked the thermostat, saw the needle pointed high enough to keep the place comfortable, but the air still held its bite. He brushed it off. Old houses, he told himself. Drafts, bad insulation. Nothing unusual. For the first few nights, everything seemed fine. The house creaked in the ways old houses do, wood groaning against the cold. Pipes rattled faintly in the walls. He told himself he was imagining the way shadows stretched too long in the corners of the rooms. Still, when he walked through the halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't entirely empty. That pressed back against his own footsteps. On the 4th night, he woke at 3:17 in the morning. At first, he didn't know why. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rush of wind against the siding. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured. He froze, holding his breath. They weren't the creaks of wood shifting under cold. They were deliberate. Someone was walking down the hallway outside his room. His heart hammered, logic chasing panic. An intruder it had to be. He grabbed the flashlight he kept by the bed, gripping it tight in his hand. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, listening. The steps were steady, moving closer. Then silence. He forced himself up, his body trembling, and flung the bedroom door open. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, dust floating like ash in the pale circle of light. The hallway was empty. Room by room, he searched. The other bedrooms, the closets, the narrow bathroom at the end of the hall. Nothing. He went downstairs, checked the living room, the kitchen, even the basement door. Still locked. Still empty. By the time he returned to his bed, his hands were shaking. He told himself he was being foolish. Old houses make noise, he whispered into the dark. That's all it was. Settling wood. But the sound still echoed in his mind, too precise, too human. The following nights confirmed it wasn't his imagination. The footsteps came again, always sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., always steady, always deliberate. They began at the far end of the hallway, near the smaller bedrooms, and paced slowly toward his door. They stopped just outside, where silence stretched thin as wire. The first time, he thought he could catch whatever it was. He flung the door open the moment the steps stopped. But there was nothing, only the empty hallway carpet, faintly pressed down as though by restless feet. He started leaving the door open at night, hoping to convince himself it was all in his head. But that made it worse. He would lie in bed staring at the dim shape of the doorway, watching shadows drift across the floor. And when the footsteps came, they weren't muffled by the door. They filled the air, crisp and undeniable. Sleep grew thin. He drifted into shallow dreams where figures leaned over him, their features blurred, their breath cold. He woke with the taste of metal in his mouth, his chest heavy. And then, one night, the steps crossed the threshold. Daniel woke to stillness. His eyes opened into the dark, and immediately he knew something was wrong. He couldn't move. Panic surged. He tried to lift his arm, but it stayed locked against the mattress. He tried to turn his head, but his neck wouldn't respond. His breath came shallow, trapped in his chest. The sound began then. Footsteps. Not in the hall this time. In the room. Slow. Deliberate. He strained against the invisible weight pinning him, terror clawing its way up his throat. His eyes darted frantically toward the corner of the room. Something was there. A shadow, taller than the doorframe, its edges shifting like smoke. It stood perfectly still, its presence heavy as stone. He couldn't see a face, but he could feel it watching him. The air grew colder, so cold it hurt to breathe. And then he felt it, damp breath against his cheek, uneven, too close. As though something leaned over him, whispering without sound. His heart thundered until he thought it would tear itself free. He tried to scream, but no sound left his throat. Time stretched. The presence loomed. He wanted to end, even if that meant never waking again. And then, all at once, the weight lifted. His muscles snapped back into motion, his lungs pulling air in desperate gasps. The room was empty, silent. He didn't sleep again that night. When morning came, his eyes burned from hours of staring at the doorway, waiting. But what unsettled him most wasn't the memory of the shadow. It was the carpet outside his room. The impressions were deeper now, clearer. Tracks pressed down by restless pacing feet. Someone had been there. For the next week, Daniel tried to convince himself it had been sleep paralysis. He researched it endlessly on his phone, scrolling through accounts of shadow figures, hallucinations, the weight on the chest. It matched what he'd felt almost perfectly. Almost. But none of those accounts mentioned footsteps that left tracks in the carpet. None of them mentioned whispers that cooled the air. None of them explained why the temperature in the house dropped every night at the same hour, even when he left the heat on full. And none of them explained the smell. It started faintly. A damp, earthy odor, like soil after rain, drifting through the upstairs hallway. Each night it grew stronger until it lingered in his bedroom. He tried airing the house, cracking windows in the bitter cold, but it always returned. Sometimes, when the smell was strongest, he thought he heard breathing. Not his own, not the quiet rhythm of a house settling. Breathing. Uneven, heavy, sometimes quickening as if excited. On the 12th night, he woke to find his bedroom door closed. He never slept with it closed anymore. He remembered leaving it open before he lay down, certain of it. But now it was shut. Latch clicked into place. His skin crawled as he forced himself to open it. The hallway stretched long and dark, empty. But the carpet told another story. The impressions weren't only outside his door anymore. They trailed down the hall, into the smaller bedroom at the end. The one he never went in. He stood there for a long time, staring at that door. He had opened it once when he first moved in, just enough to see the faded wallpaper, the small bed frame left behind by whoever lived here before. Something about the room felt wrong. He never set foot in it again. Now, though, the tracks in the carpet led straight to it. He told himself not to. Told himself to turn around, go back, pretend it wasn't there. But something pulled at him, a quiet insistence in the silence. His hand lifted, trembling, and he pushed the door open. The smell hit him instantly. Damp earth, stronger than ever. The room was colder than the rest of the house, the air heavy enough to feel like water in his lungs. The bed frame sat in the corner, draped in a sheet yellowed with age. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, curling against the floor. And on the carpet, pressed deep into the fibers, were tracks. Not just pacing this time, circling the bed. Over and over. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut, his chest tight. He pressed his back against the opposite wall, his breath coming fast, fogging the cold air. The silence was heavier now. Watching, waiting. That night, he dreamed of the room. He was lying on the old bed, the sheet pulled over him. Something moved around him, circling, its steps pressing closer with each pass. The sheet clung to his face, suffocating, but he couldn't move to push it away. He couldn't breathe. When he woke, the sheet from a spare bed was draped across his own body. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. He dragged his mattress downstairs to the living room, telling himself it was temporary. But the footsteps followed. He heard them on the staircase, slow and patient, then across the living room floor. The carpet impressions appeared at the foot of the mattress each morning. The presence had grown bolder. The whispers were no longer faint. Sometimes, as he drifted at the edge of sleep, he heard his name, drawn out, breathless, Daniel. Other times, he woke to the sound of something scraping along the walls. Long, dragging sounds like nails across wood. The house was no longer silent. It was alive, restless, and he was trapped inside it. And deep down, Daniel began to suspect that whatever walked the halls at night wasn't bound to the house alone. The days blurred together in uneasy silence. Daniel found himself avoiding the second floor altogether. He would glance at the staircase from the living room, its dark mouth yawning upward, and feel the same heaviness in his chest each time. Something waited there, something that belonged to the night. Still, he couldn't shake the need to understand. Each day, he wandered the house, searching for explanations. He checked for drafts, broken vents, loose floorboards. He crawled into the basement with a flashlight, scanning the concrete walls for cracks or mold that might explain the smell. But there was nothing. The air down there was stale, yes, but not damp. The smell came only at night, only from the upstairs rooms, and it grew stronger whenever the footsteps walked. He stopped using the bedroom entirely, but sleep still wouldn't come. Even downstairs, with his mattress pulled against the living room wall, he woke each night around the same time, always just after 3. Sometimes it was the footsteps that woke him, crossing the floors above or moving slowly down the stairs. Sometimes it was the whisper of his name, close to his ear, dragging him violently from whatever fragile dream he had found. Daniel. He started leaving lights on. The lamp beside his mattress burned all night, casting weak golden pools across the floor. But the light didn't stop the presence. If anything, it made it easier to see. He would wake and see the shadows shift unnaturally across the far wall, bending in ways the lamp couldn't explain. He would blink and catch the impression of something tall moving past the doorway, just beyond the edge of vision. More than once, he saw the outline of feet pressed against the carpet, not walking, not moving, but standing at the foot of his bed, always facing him, always waiting. Exhaustion hollowed him out. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends. He couldn't explain it to anyone. How do you tell someone that your house walks at night? He began eating little, surviving mostly on coffee, his hands trembling constantly. His reflection in the bathroom mirror grew paler each day, his eyes ringed in bruised circles. Sometimes, when he leaned close to the glass, he thought he saw another face watching from behind his own. He told himself he was losing his mind, that all of this was the product of sleeplessness and stress, that if he just rested, just pushed through, it would all stop. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't brought this upon himself. He had walked into a house that had been waiting for him. The 13th night downstairs was the worst yet. Daniel had finally drifted into shallow sleep when the sound pulled him awake. Not footsteps this time, a dragging noise. He froze, his breath sharp in his throat. It started on the second floor, long and scraping, like something heavy pulled across wood. Then it moved to the staircase. The sound groaned down each step, slow, patient, as though whatever carried it wanted him to hear every inch of its descent. He pulled the blanket tight against himself, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the staircase doorway. The living room lamp cast enough light for him to see the first few steps. Empty. The sound stopped at the bottom step. Silence stretched. He strained to hear, every muscle trembling. Then came the breathing. Not his. Deeper, heavier. From the doorway. The lamp flickered once, twice, and then steadied. In that moment, he saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body was darker than shadow, edges shifting like smoke. Where its face should have been, there was nothing but hollow blackness. It stood in the doorway, still and silent. Daniel's breath caught. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but his body locked in place. His chest burned with panic. The figure tilted slightly, as though observing him. Then it stepped into the living room. The air grew colder with each step. Frost bloomed faintly across the glass of the windows. Daniel's teeth chattered as the figure approached. It stopped at the foot of his mattress, the dark void where its face should be leaned forward, inches from his own. He felt the breath again, damp, uneven, rancid. Daniel. The voice wasn't loud. It was a whisper, but it carried weight, vibrating in his bones. He shut his eyes tight, praying it would vanish. When he opened them again, the figure was gone. But the blanket across his body had been pulled down to his chest, neatly folded, as though invisible hands had done it while he lay frozen. The next day, Daniel knew he couldn't go on like this. He needed answers. He left the house for the first time in days, blinking against the pale winter sun. At the small diner in town, he asked questions carefully. At first, the locals were polite but distant, their smiles strained. But when he mentioned the house, their expressions shifted. Some looked away. Others grew quiet. Finally, an older woman sitting at the counter leaned toward him. "You're renting the Wexler place?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. Her lips pressed tight. Should have been torn down years ago. She wouldn't say much more, but Daniel pressed until she gave him what little she knew. The last tenant, a man in his 50s, had died in the upstairs bedroom. No one had found him for days. He had simply stopped waking. The coroner said it was natural causes, but neighbors remembered him complaining about strange things before it happened. Voices, footsteps, cold spots in the house. The same things Daniel now lived with. But that wasn't the first death in the house. Years before, a young woman had been found in the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall. No one spoke of the details, only that she had been alone for weeks before anyone thought to check. Daniel listened, his stomach sinking deeper with each word. When he asked if anyone else had lived there after, the woman shook her head. "Not for long," she whispered. "It doesn't let them stay." He left the diner shaken. As he walked back through the snow, the house loomed in the distance, its windows glinting in the pale sun like watching eyes. It hadn't let them stay, and now it had him. That night, he tried something different. He left his phone recording on the coffee table, hoping to catch proof of what happened while he slept. If he could just hear it play back, he told himself he'd know it was real. The next morning, he sat with trembling hands and pressed play. For the first hour, nothing but silence. Then faint creaks, the shift of old wood. Then the footsteps, clear, steady, pacing across the floor above. His breath quickened as he listened. They grew louder, moved down the stairs. He remembered this part, the terror of lying frozen as it descended. Then came the breathing, deep, uneven. And then, through the static, the voice. Daniel. He dropped the phone. His chest tightened as the sound echoed in his head. He had proof now. Proof that it wasn't just in his mind. But that only made it worse, because it meant the thing in his house was real. And it knew his name. That night, he didn't even try to sleep. He sat awake in the living room, every light in the house blazing. Midnight passed. 1 o'clock. 2. His body begged for rest, but he fought it, eyes burning. At 3:12 a.m., the lights went out. Not all at once. One by one, in quick succession. The kitchen light blinked out, then the hallway, then the lamp beside him, until only darkness remained. The footsteps began immediately, from upstairs. Moving fast this time, almost eager, Daniel backed into the corner, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. The steps reached the stairs, descended quickly, heavy against the wood. They reached the living room doorway. And then, silence. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there. Watching, waiting. The air thickened. His lungs burned. And then the voice came again, closer than ever. "Stay." The first true week in the house passed with Daniel, trying to adjust to his new reality. He had convinced himself, out of necessity, that the footsteps, the whispers, and the cold dread creeping into his bones every night were products of exhaustion, of stress, of his overactive imagination. By day, the house was bathed in sunlight, and the dust motes drifting lazily in the golden air seemed innocent enough. He told himself he was simply lonely, that the mind plays tricks when left in silence too long. But deep down, Daniel knew there was something else at work. On the 7th night, as the clock inched closer to 3 in the morning, he deliberately forced himself to stay awake. He sat propped up in bed, a mug of black coffee on his nightstand, the weak glow of his lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His body begged for sleep, his eyelids fluttering heavily, but his resolve held. He wanted to know if the noises came when he was awake, not only when he was dreaming. The first sound was faint, but unmistakable. A dull creak, as though weight had settled on the old wooden floor in the hallway. Daniel sat upright, every muscle rigid, his hand tightening around the blanket. Then came another step, slow, dragging, deliberate. He focused on the sound, willing himself not to blink, not to panic. The steps grew closer, echoing just outside his bedroom door. He reached for the flashlight beside his bed, and with a trembling hand, flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the closed door. The steps had stopped. Silence pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. He listened, heart hammering so hard it hurt, for even the faintest breath, but the hallway outside was utterly still. Gathering what little courage he had, Daniel slid off the bed and crept toward the door, each movement painfully slow. The doorknob felt icy under his palm as he wrapped his fingers around it. He hesitated, breath caught in his throat, then yanked the door open. The hallway stretched before him, empty. His flashlight beam danced over peeling wallpaper, faded picture hooks, and the uneven boards beneath his feet. But no one was there. He almost convinced himself to laugh. Almost, until he lowered the flashlight toward the floor. The old carpet was pressed down in fresh, clear impressions. Not footprints exactly, but patches worn smooth, as though someone had been pacing the same strip of hallway over and over again for hours. Daniel froze, staring at the evidence of movement where no one had been. His pulse roared in his ears, and he fought the rising urge to flee down the stairs, to abandon the house entirely. But some stubborn instinct told him to hold his ground. It's old flooring, he whispered to himself, voice shaking. Old carpet. It's nothing. He shut the door, locked it, and climbed back into bed. But sleep never came. The next night, Daniel tried something new. He placed a small chair against the door handle, a crude barricade, convincing himself it would help him rest easier. He drifted in and out of uneasy slumber until, as always, the clock struck 3:17 a.m. He knew the time without looking. The moment his eyes snapped open, the familiar pressure weighed down on his chest, and the air turned sour and cold. The footsteps began again, slow, measured, right outside his door. He listened as the pacing stopped, directly on the other side. The chair rattled against the handle, a faint, deliberate push. Daniel's breath caught. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body refused to move, locked in that terrible paralysis again. The chair creaked as though something leaned against it from the hallway. A whisper slid through the crack at the bottom of the door, so faint he might have imagined it, except it spoke his name. Daniel. His blood turned to ice. And then silence. When he woke the next morning, sunlight filling the room, the chair was no longer braced against the door. It sat perfectly upright in the middle of the room, facing his bed. Daniel's sanity began to fray in small, quiet ways after that. He forgot meals. He caught himself staring at the same wall for hours. When he did leave the house, strangers gave him curious, unsettled looks, as though they could sense the weight clinging to him. One afternoon, he stopped at the corner store. The cashier, a woman in her 60s with kind but weary eyes, paused when she saw him. She glanced over her shoulder as though deciding whether to say anything. Then, in a low voice, she asked, "You're renting the old Myers place, aren't you?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah. Why?" Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "I'd be careful if I were you. People don't stay there long." "What happened?" he asked. The woman's gaze darted toward the window, then back to him. "Man before you. Died in his sleep. Young. Just like you." She hesitated, lowering her voice even further. "He told me once. He heard footsteps too. Daniel's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he set down his change and left the store without another word. The cold air outside hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to shake off the sense of dread coiling tighter around him. That night, Daniel didn't bother with barricades. He sat awake in bed, waiting. The house was so silent he could hear the faint tick of the pipes, the occasional sigh of which shifting in the cold. Hours crawled by. Then, right on time, came the first step. But this time, the footsteps didn't stop at the hallway. They entered the room. Daniel couldn't see it. Not fully. The shadows shifted strangely in the corners, bending in ways that didn't match the lamp's weak glow. The air grew heavier, pressing down on his lungs. He tried to move, but paralysis rooted him in place once more. He could only watch from the corner of his eye as something impossibly tall, impossibly thin, loomed near the edge of the bed. The shape leaned closer, closer still, until he swore he could feel its cold breath on his cheek. Then, in a voice like cracking wood, it whispered the same word again, "Daniel." The light flickered, and the room went black. Daniel tried to convince himself that he was simply exhausted, that his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring footsteps and whispers because of stress. But as the days passed, the house itself began to resist that rational explanation. He would come home from work and find things moved slightly, nothing dramatic, never enough for someone else to notice, but just enough that Daniel knew. His jacket that he hung by the door would be draped across the chair in the kitchen. A glass he had left on the counter would somehow be back in the sink, still damp as though freshly washed. At first he thought he was forgetting, maybe rushing in the mornings, but the more it happened, the more deliberate it felt. The nights were the worst. Every evening, as soon as the clock ticked past midnight, the house seemed to breathe differently. The stillness changed into a kind of watchfulness, as though the walls themselves had ears. Daniel would sometimes sit in the living room with all the lights on, listening, waiting. It was during one of those long, uneasy vigils that he heard the faintest sound of someone humming. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, but it was unmistakable. A low, tuneless hum, drifting through the floorboards above him. The sound lasted only a few seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so thick it made his skin crawl. Daniel tried to laugh it off, telling himself it could have been pipes or the wind, but deep down he knew. Pipes don't hum. Wind doesn't stop when it realizes you're listening. Sleep grew more elusive. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the steps that always came between 3 and 4 in the morning. And they came without fail. First soft, then deliberate, each one dragging slightly as though whoever walked carried an invisible weight. Sometimes they lingered right outside his door, a presence pressing against the barrier between him and whatever stalked the halls. One night, unable to take it anymore, Daniel decided to confront the sound directly. He left his bedroom door slightly ajar and sat upright in bed, heart pounding, flashlight in his grip. He told himself he would wait, and when the footsteps came, he'd burst out into the hallway and prove to himself that nothing was there. The minutes crawled by, thick and heavy. The house was so quiet that he could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then, as though right on schedule, the steps began. One after another, slow, dragging, moving closer. Daniel's throat tightened as the sound grew louder, approaching the door. When a shadow passed across the thin strip of light under the door, Daniel's courage faltered. He wanted to leap up, to shine the light, to prove his own sanity, but his body betrayed him. His chest tightened, his arms refused to move, and before he knew it, he was caught in that familiar, suffocating paralysis. His muscles were locked, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. The shadow lingered outside the door, stretching unnaturally against the sliver of light, far too tall, its edges blurring as though it wasn't bound by solid form. Daniel's mind screamed for him to act, but his body remained a prisoner. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. It didn't swing open quickly. No, this was worse. The knob moved fraction by fraction, deliberate, testing. Daniel's frozen eyes filled with tears, his body rigid with terror. The gap in the door widened just slightly, and through it he thought he saw an outline, something leaning close as if listening. The pressure in the air thickened. The hum returned, low and throaty now, almost right against his ear, though the thing was still outside. His skin prickled with the sensation of invisible fingers brushing against it. And just as the door seemed ready to open further, just when Daniel thought he would finally see whatever had plagued him for weeks, it stopped. The knob released, the shadow drew back, and the footsteps retreated down the hallway, fading into the silence. When the paralysis broke, Daniel shot out of bed, flicked on every light in the house, and searched furiously. Nothing. Every door locked, every window sealed. Yet the feeling remained, heavy and suffocating. Whatever was in the house wasn't interested in leaving. That night, Daniel didn't sleep at all. By morning, with bloodshot eyes and shaking hands, he walked to the neighbor's house across the street. He hadn't spoken much to them before, but desperation left no room for shyness. The elderly woman who answered looked at him with immediate recognition when he told her which house he lived in. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper when she said, "You're not the first." She wouldn't give details, not yet, but her silence spoke volumes. Daniel left with a pit in his stomach and a dread that no daylight could erase. The house had a memory, and he was part of it now. Daniel had gotten used to the odd rhythms of the house, or so he told himself. The drafts, the unexplained creaks, the faint tapping that seemed to come from the pipes, but always at the wrong times. It all could be reasoned away, at least in daylight. By now, nearly 3 weeks had passed since he moved into the place, and he convinced himself that whatever lingered in its walls was a product of his own exhaustion, or maybe a mix of loneliness and imagination. He would work longer hours at the shop, come home late, collapse in a bed, and hope the night passed quickly. But the house had other plans. It began with the mirrors. He had never really paid much attention to them before. The house had come with 2 fixed mirrors, an oval one on the landing near the staircase, and a larger rectangular mirror bolted to the wall of his bedroom. They weren't modern, but they weren't old enough to seem out of place either. Still, there was something unsettling about their presence. One night, Daniel caught his reflection in the oval landing mirror as he passed, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn his reflection wasn't moving in sync. His heart thudded once in his chest, hard, and he froze, staring at the glass. But when he stepped back, leaned forward, waved a hand, everything lined up as it should. Sleep deprivation, he muttered aloud, trying to steady himself. His own voice sounded hollow in the corridor. He laughed lightly, more to break the silence than anything else, and went to bed. But from that night onward, the mirrors unsettled him. He'd glance into the one in his bedroom and feel as though something was standing just behind his shoulder, too tall, too narrow, too still. He would whip around and find nothing but an empty room. Yet each time, a faint, bitter smell lingered in the air, sharp and metallic, like rust and soil mixed together. Then came the night when the pacing outside his door changed. He woke at 3:17 a.m. as usual, his body conditioned to the sound of those heavy, deliberate footsteps. But this time they did not pace back and forth. They started at one end of the hallway, slow, deliberate, dragging slightly, as though someone's weight was uneven, one leg stiff or broken. The sound approached, step by step, until it stopped directly outside his door. Daniel sat up in bed, adrenaline surging. He stared at the door, waiting for it to creak open. Nothing happened. The silence was worse than the steps. He forced himself to breathe, listening, straining. And then, 3 sharp knocks. Not random creaks. Not the house settling. Knocks. Clear. Deliberate. Right at his bedroom door. His throat went dry. He wanted to shout, to say who's there, but no words came. He could only sit there, staring, as the knocks repeated, slower this time, each one echoing in the air like a countdown. Finally, Daniel lunged out of bed, crossed the room, and flung the door open. The hallway stretched out in darkness. Cold air rushed past him, as though the house itself exhaled. And on the carpet, In the pale silver wash of moonlight from the landing window, there were indentations. Footprints, bare feet, pressed deeply into the fibers, as though someone had been standing there only seconds before. Daniel staggered back, slammed the door shut, and braced his weight against it. But the silence that followed was worse than any noise he could have imagined. He did not sleep again that night. The next morning, he noticed something else. In the oval landing mirror, streaked faintly across the glass, were 3 marks. Not scratches, smudges, as though someone had dragged damp, dirty fingers across the surface. 3 parallel lines, running downward, stopping abruptly at the center. He scrubbed the mirror with a cloth until they faded. But no matter how hard he worked, faint shadows of the streaks remained, etched into the glass. That evening, Daniel bought a lock for his bedroom door. For a while, it gave him comfort. He could shut the world out, turn the key, and at least feel he had some barrier between himself and whatever haunted the house. But comfort was fleeting. A lock does nothing when the thing you fear is already inside. It was the 5th night after the mirror smudges that Daniel experienced the most vivid episode yet. He woke in the dead hour, paralyzed once again. His body locked in place, his eyes wide open. At first, he thought it was the usual sleep paralysis, terrifying but fleeting. The room was dim, shadows stretched across the walls, and the silence was heavy. Then he noticed something new. The mirror on his wall. Something moved inside it. Not just his reflection. Another shape, faint and indistinct, pacing in the glass as though it were a window to another hallway. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, his imagination twisting the shapes of shadows, but no. This was different. The figure in the glass was taller than him, narrower, its limbs too long, its movements too deliberate. It paused behind his reflection, leaning close, though in the real room behind him, there was nothing. He could feel it breathing on his neck, though no air stirred. And then it smiled. Or at least, he thought it did. His reflection's face stayed frozen, pale and terrified, but the shape behind it stretched into a wide, glistening grin, teeth far too many, gleaming faintly in the dark. Daniel tried to scream, but his jaw wouldn't move. His chest heaved with the effort, but the sound was trapped inside his lungs. All he could do was stare, helpless, as the grin widened and widened until it filled the glass. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. His body released, the mirror went still, and the figure was gone. He bolted from bed, snatched a blanket, and covered the mirror entirely. That night, he sat on the floor, back against the door, too afraid to sleep, listening to the faint hum of the house breathing all around him. The next morning, the blanket was on the floor, folded neatly. That was when Daniel realized he wasn't just living in a haunted house. The house was watching him, learning him, testing the edges of his sanity. And for the first time since moving in, he began to wonder if he would ever be able to leave. Because every night, the presence grew bolder. Every night, it came closer. And in the deepest part of himself, Daniel feared something he could not bring himself to say aloud. Maybe the house didn't want him to leave at all. The final night in the house arrived without warning. Daniel had been making arrangements to move out, boxes half-packed, keys almost ready to return. He told himself he just had to make it until morning. One more night. Just one. But the house seemed to know. The silence that evening was unbearable, thicker than the air in a coffin. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old frame seemed to have stilled, as though the house were holding its breath, waiting. Daniel tried to distract himself with a book, the television, even humming to himself, but none of it worked. When the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The cold came first, sweeping through the upstairs hall and into his room. The light bulb flickered. Then came the sound, the footsteps. He had grown used to them in a terrible way. But tonight, they weren't measured and deliberate. They were frantic, running, back and forth, up and down the stairs, pounding, hammering, as though something unseen was racing wildly through the house. Daniel clutched the edge of his bed, heart hammering. He He whispered to himself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't touch him. But then the doorknob turned. Slowly, with precision. The latch clicked and the door creaked open. He could not move. The figure stepped inside, tall, darker than the shadows, its outline bending unnaturally against the dim light. It had no face, and yet he knew it was looking directly at him. The air in the room turned wet, like breathing in water. His chest ached. He wanted to scream, but his jaw locked. Then it leaned close. For the first time, Daniel heard it speak. A whisper, broken, echoing, layered with more than one voice. "You are my bed." In a final burst of desperate will, Daniel forced his body to move. He lurched from the bed, stumbling past the shadow, nearly falling down the stairs as he tore through the house. He didn't stop to grab his keys, didn't stop to lock the door. He simply fled into the icy night, barefoot, running until his lungs burned. He never went back. The landlord found the place abandoned weeks later, Daniel's belongings still inside. He mailed what he could to him, but Daniel never opened the boxes. For years afterward, he couldn't sleep through the night. Hotels, apartments, borrowed couches, none of them felt safe. And always, in the back of his mind, he wondered if it was still following him. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, when the world